Prosecutors must decide by the end of July whether to file criminal or civil charges against billionaire hedge fund manager Steve Cohen and his firm, SAC Capital. SAC, for its part, says it's no longer cooperating fully with the government's investigation. And there's also a report Cohen has been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. With us from Chicago is attorney Andrew Stoltmann, whose firm represents victims of investment fraud. Andrew, just to be clear, you are in no way involved in the SAC Capital case. Is that correct?
I'm not.
So let me ask you this question to begin with. We learned on Friday that SAC Capital, and presumably Steve Cohen as well, no longer plan to cooperate fully with the government's investigation. What does that say to you?
You know, Eric, that tells me that there's a real chance that something's going on behind the scenes that we just don't know. I think what's happening is that the noose is tightening around the necks of both SAC and its billionaire founder, Steven Cohen. And I think they're getting really nervous. I think they're hunkering down, and I think they're trying to figure out what the heck the government and federal prosecutors are going to do, because they do face a real chance that either the company itself or even potentially Steven Cohen could be criminally indicted in the near future.
That is clearly possible, Andrew, but I have heard as well the idea that this suggests the government is desperate, and that because the government is resorting to desperate means because it doesn't have a nailed-shut case against Steve Cohen, that the firm is responding and saying, you know, we've been happy to cooperate with you up until now, but if you're going to go to those lengths, I'm afraid we can't cooperate as fully as we have been up until this point.
I don't think there's any question that that's a distinct possibility as well. And I do think there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that we just don't know. For example, there have been two SAC portfolio managers who have recently been indicted, and that's Matthew Martoma and Michael Steinberg. And we don't know if they're cooperating with federal prosecutors, which is a distinct possibility because they both face the real possibility, if they're convicted, of a 20-year sentence in a federal prison. So there's stuff like that may be going on behind the scenes, that possibly they are now cooperating with federal prosecutors, and maybe that's the reason why SAC is now hunkering down a little bit.
Now, Andrew, what about the grand jury factor? This idea that Steve Cohen himself may have been subpoenaed to appear before and testify before a grand jury. How does that change anything?
Well, you know, that's an interesting development because, first off, I don't think there's any question that Cohen's lawyers will not let him testify in front of the grand jury, or if he does, he'll simply plead the fifth. Because, as you know, often a grand jury investigation or grand jury testimony is a backdoor way to get a criminal indictment for lying under oath, and that's a typical tactic that prosecutors use when they're not all that confident about about their case. So I think it's possible that that Steve Cohen will have to testify. But if he does, I think very clearly he'll plead the fifth, because if he doesn't and if he testifies, there's a real chance that the prosecutors may have a couple of gotchas set up for him, and that could get him an indictment.
Now, wouldn't that support the desperation thesis, though? If they had to go so far as to impanel a grand jury in order to get a backdoor indictment, then maybe they really don't have the goods against Steve Cohen, should the goods exist.
Eric, I think that's probably the number one fact that those who are saying the government's on a witch hunt are pointing to, because it's real uncommon when you have a target of an investigation like this to be asked to or required to appear in front of a grand jury. So that certainly would support the argument that the government is kind of on a desperate witch hunt and they're kind of throwing a Hail Mary. I personally still don't think that's the case.